the room tone. Room tonic. Is she greasy? Is this bitch recording? It's gonna be what it's gonna be. It is what it is. My good bitch, it is what it is.
Samba tarka ishtunever. Samba tarka ishtunever.
The Disney Channel original movie Life Size is a story of a young girl and her doll, Eve, a copyright-proof stand-in for Barbie.
Samba tarka ishtunever.
By way of a few clumsy, vaguely Middle Eastern mutterings, Eve is brought to life and guides a young Lindsay Lohan through some girlhood struggle with her impending pubescence.
She's a techno-pagan, right?
The living Eve is played by global temptress and tormentor of thin women from coast to coast, Tyra Banks. It's an odd couple to be sure, but despite the fact of her mass manufacture, Eve adequately teaches her young pupil to accept herself and embrace her individuality with the following incantation.
Shine bright, shine far. Be a star. Where you live, where you want, be a star.
The doll come to life is a story as old as Ovid, who, in his Metamorphoses, told the story of King Pygmalion. Pygmalion, burdened by the scourge of prostitution run rampant across the land, takes a vow of celibacy and commits his life to sculpture. He consequently produces an ivory sculpture of a woman so flawless she comes to life. Admittedly, Life Size has very little to do with prostitution or the dangers of desire, but it does in its own way say a few things about sculpture, ideal femininity, and the treachery of images.
Step 1. Prepare the altar.
One scene involves a date asking Eve about her active lifestyle.
And you were in such terrific shape. I mean, how do you do so many things and still find time to work out?
To which she replies,
But fitness is very important. Do you know I'm anatomically correct?
and he responds,
It's my favorite type.
Early on the date, that same man obliquely asks about her origins,
Well, they sure know how to make them in Sunnyvale.
For me? I wasn't made there.
No? Where?
to which Eve replies,
Indonesia, but I was packaged locally.
Now again, Life Size shouldn't be about sexuality or the racial implications of labor in a global economy, but the impulse to sneak those jokes into the script is curious, to say the least. Even in a children's movie, the draw of race, beauty, and the manufactured female form seems irresistible. It goes back even to the beginning of Christian time. Note the doll named Eve. Eve after the fall, Eve disconsolate, Eve tempted. But setting aside both Pygmalion and Adam's ribs, this trope appears on screen in the 1955 musical, A Touch of Venus.
How could he ignore my available condition? Why these Victorian views? You see here before you a woman's definition.
Which is based on the 1921 silent film, The Tinted Venus, which in turn was based on the 1885 novella of the same title. This was another Pygmalion story, more explicitly about Victorian sexual mores.
I must discover the key to his ignition.
But its title was pulled from an earlier media event, rather explicitly about race, beauty, and labor in a globalizing economy. So, let's get into the 19th century.
And then if he should make a diplomatic proposition, how can I possibly refuse?
In 1851, damage, because I know. In 1851, in London's Hyde Park, within the 530-meter-long Crystal Palace, was housed the great exhibition of works of industry of all nations. This was the first of what will become a great many World's Fairs. The Crystal Palace, also known as the Great Shalimar, served as a giant display case for new technologies, such as a 16-foot telescope and the world's first flushable toilets, a display case for newly acquired artifacts from newly acquired colonies, such as the world's largest diamond at the time, the Koh-i-Noor, which now sits amongst England's crown jewels. It was a hit at the India exhibit, and it served as a display case for fine artists to display their newly developed techniques. One such artist was John Gibson, whose Tinted Venus graced the Crystal Palace to an audience in the hundreds of thousands.
This look is gorgeous.
She was as lifelike as you would expect from the 19th century neoclassicist. So you would expect the normal amount of fanfare, making all the required overtures to the nobility, intellect, and restraint of the ancients. Carved from marble, based like many artworks on the ancient Aphrodite of Knidos, and set within a rotunda of columns which appropriately gestured into the mists of time. Not to mention, just nude enough to survive the palates of the taste-making elites. This was all the rage in statuary at the time. The critics generally lived for this shit, but there was one problem. She was colored.
As you can see, I love pink.
Using a process that involved mixing hot wax and paint, Gibson was able to affix color to the stone in a process known as polychromy, many colors. But amidst all the scientific and ethnic novelty within the walls of the great Shalimar, it seemed that there were a few things you just didn't play with. Chief among them, the European fantasy of a bleached antiquity. Thousands of years of ecological wear and tear had caused any color to be rubbed off of the ancient Greek sculptures, and so it would seem that Gibson had improved upon the ancients. Adding subtle peaches and pinks to mimic the flesh of a living woman, Gibson brought a more lifelike presence to his Venus. A presence which perhaps too closely approached Pygmalion. A presence that drove the press to ridicule and men to frenzy.
And then if he should make a diplomatic proposition.
Why don't we get out of here, huh? Away from all this noise, just you and me. Isn't that what you want? Whoa, what was that?
Wasn't I supposed to do that? You're being forward.
In this video, we'll see the ideological motivations for those reactions, the gendered nature of those reactions, and the consequences such reactions would have for the sculpted form of Black women. But to put it perhaps too simply, the problem was that she was colored, and
Pussy is pink, baby.
First I've heard.
welcome to Drapetomania, where I make my way unguided and ill-informed through art history, visual culture, and critical theory. So normally I'd spend the better part of a couple of weeks, or most recently a year, reading an excessive amount of complex theory, synthesizing it into a script about some pop culture object, recording a video, cringing at the sound of my own voice, and bitterly seething at the view count. While this channel has been, and still is, a very expensive labor of a very exhausting love, it's not sustainable this way. So I need to grow. It's all very startup. So I've given myself a little more than a week to do all of this, which means a little less synthesis and a little more focused analysis. In this video, we'll be focusing on Charmaine A. Nelson's work in The Color of Stone. I need to get enough views to amass enough clout to gain a sponsorship from Lockheed Martin, or enough subscribers to make my Patreon viable. If you were wondering, this is the part where you like and subscribe. At this stage, the videos perform noticeably better when y'all do that shit. Deadass. And if I somehow survive this quicker turnaround, it will be good to know that I can make more focused videos and not alienate my audience. Do correct me if I'm wrong, preferably in the comments. And if you know anyone with an institutional interest in whatever I think I'm doing here, you can share a link. Similar calls to action will appear in every subsequent video until they're obsolete. Now, where were we? Ah, yes.
Pussy is pink, baby.
While the contemporary art world seems a bit remote and abstract to public life, when it came to art and society, the 19th century girls really gave a fuck. And touring globally from the Crystal Palace all the way to the Philadelphia Academy of the Arts, the Tinted Venus was very much art in society. For reasons we'll explore later, neoclassical sculpture was required to be white, pure, polished, unblemished, and untouched marble. Adding color to this sort of material was seen pretty actively as a perversion. Commenting on the importance of marble's purity and taking a bold swipe at Gibson's taste, in December of 1868, Anne Brewster remarked, "Painted statues are repulsive to the modern eye and taste. Gibson's tinted one in the Philadelphia Academy is a ghastly thing, and it seems impossible for us moderns to accept this practice of the ancients." The shade. It recalls certain responses to the recently unveiled monument to Martin and Coretta Scott King. Outside of how seriously she questions Gibson's choice, she does note that her revulsion is a matter of taste. Given all the ways neoclassical sculpture purportedly wished to reproduce the art of antiquity, it seems strange that their taste should diverge at all. Brewster just barely acknowledges that modern taste does not align with that practice of the ancients, and she was right.
One man is above all responsible for the whitewashing of antiquity. His name was Johann Joachim Winckelmann.
In a previous video about the alt-right and the toppling of monuments, I made mention of a certain historical homosexual, Johann Joachim Winckelmann.
He was gay.
Oh, what you said? Queen.
The man whose Teutonic tastes gave birth to art history as a discipline and the West's obsession with white statues. I believe the term was alabaster anachronisms.
So the ancient world was not like this. When you see white here, you have to imagine vibrant color. So marble was just a canvas that a painter would decorate.
The combination of casual 18th century archaeology and thousands of years of erosion had led Winckelmann to believe that the highest point of Greek sculpture was also its whitest.
These white sculptures were the most wonderful objects that Winckelmann had ever seen.
But if we're not careful, we can easily misattribute this celebration of whiteness to a certain ethnic flair for the Caucasian. While that would come soon enough, Winckelmann's interest in whiteness was a sign of the intellectual superiority of the ancient Greeks.
Well, I think for Winckelmann, whiteness symbolized all of the great qualities of ancient Greek civilization.
A belief that the fathers of democracy were so intellectually beyond simple representation that they delighted publicly in the pleasures of pure form. They had no need for color. Since the 18th century, the French Academy had viewed color as a seductive distraction, a mere simulation of the real, which impeded the beauty, grace, purity, and nobility of white neoclassical sculptural form. Winkelmann and the subsequent neoclassical craze took this colorness as a sort of abstract formalism.
Look at it. And there are no garish colours, there are no vulgar patterns. It's stripped back, it's restrained.
A formalism that had intellectual and moral effects.
It's intellectual. I mean, this is art that's not there to flatter the eyes, it's there to stimulate the brain. And this proved to Winkelmann how sophisticated the ancient Greeks really were.
The angry children you watch topple statues are truly and utterly stupid.
So, while the whiteness of ancient statuary was a confused aesthetic property, this aesthetic property was important because of its moral and social value.
And reason. Now, these were the values that he wanted his age to take up. So,
while not nearly as nefarious as the spectacle of undernourished women bumbling their way across a treacherous waterway, this concern for sculpture was social. And this presumed social utility carried through the 19th century. So when it came to Gibson's Venus, tinted sculpture provided a distraction that was sensorial and emotive, experienced at the level of feeling rather than thinking. Critic James Jackson Jarvis says that the use of color was anti-intellectual. Artificial enjoyment of color, such as tinting marble, strikes the mind disagreeably as falsification of the material without any adequate motive. It was art that was for the body and not for the mind. That using color to reproduce reality in sculpture was crass and tasteless. We look to sculpture for form alone. If it attempt more, it becomes painful as a violation of its primary truth. Indeed, I believe for sculpture itself, as confined to the human figure, that the intellectual pleasure diminishes in the degree that pure white is departed from as its material. But despite all the arguments about truth and falsification, trickery and intellectual dishonesty were not the only issue when it came to white sculpture. In some cases, illuminating the sculptures with colored light was celebrated as a technical achievement. So this wasn't an issue of color on the body. It was an issue of the color of the body. As a reminder,
Honey, cause pussy is pink, baby.
Despite the obvious implications, Winkelmann's interest in whiteness isn't identical to an interest in the white racial body. While this would clearly change come the 19th century, a great deal of neoclassical discourse seems to actively disavow anybody. It seems that much of the protesting against color in sculpture was that it became too real, almost protesting too much.
in fact, just the sight of him got Winkelmann hyperventilating.
Our marble body was a body with no color, stimulating a sort of abstract intellectual experience. See Nathaniel Hawthorne's lament at the early death of sculptor Thomas Crawford. It is rather sad to think that Crawford died before he could see his ideas in the marble, where they gleam with so pure and celestial a light as compared with the plaster. There is almost as much difference between the flesh and the spirit. Alongside the intellectual uplift provided by white abstraction, Hawthorne invokes the spiritual, moral aspects of the material, calling it so pure and celestial a light.
Shine bright, shine bright, don't be shy, be a star. Where you live, where you are, shout it out, be a star.
This was, of course, the Age of Reason, where the spiritual contest between the spirit and the flesh gave way to its more high-minded replacement, the mind versus the flesh. Great art was white because white was not a color. Great art was so uniform because it was for the mind. And great art was marble because it was so clearly not flesh. And, say it with me,
Honey, cause pussy is pink, baby.
So, let's return to tinted Venus with her blue eyes, hay-colored hair, holding a shimmering gilded apple, with pale periwinkle fabrics draped across her subtly pink skin. Skin which, according to Hawthorne, looks to have been stained with tobacco juice. That's a direct quote. This disgust complicates the issue, and the tobacco comment complicates it further. If the issue was that the sculpture had to be white because of some intellectual or moral value, then we can agree Gibson failed. But colored marble didn't provoke boredom or disappointment. It provoked disgust. And that's because theories of the aesthetic aren't simply exercises in formal logic. They're theories about how people come to feel. And disgust at the tobacco-tainted flesh wasn't the only thing the girls were feeling.
There was plenty to, shall we say, feast his eyes on. There were buttocks aplenty, ripped, muscular torsos, and there was even the odd genital. There were
objects for your pleasure.
Some viewers, clearly the minority, Edward E. Hale among them, claimed that Gibson's tinting of marble was an aesthetic achievement, bringing the sculpture to life and not simply a failure to conform to neoclassical dictates. He expounds, "You have seen Venus in plaster. You see her now in marble uncolored. The figure is exquisite, and you think you are satisfied. When a curtain is drawn and you see her sister, alive and not dead, triumphant with her gold apple, instead of shivering in affected triumph. Bemused, she is ruddy and warm, and not cold and blue. Exquisite, alive, warm, ruddy. Put a pin in that last one. But this reality was precisely the problem. Paraphrasing sculptor Hiram Powers, Nathaniel Hawthorne remarks, "The best thing Powers said against the use of color in marble was to the effect that whiteness removed the object represented into a sort of spiritual region, and so gave chaste permission to those nudities which would otherwise suggest immodesty. I have myself felt the truth of this, in a certain sense of shame as I looked at Gibson's Tinted Venus." So this is where we get the real tea. On top of asserting the ugliness of stained sculpture, Hawthorne registers a shame specifically against the realism of a colored nude, explaining that stony white abstraction gave chaste permission to view the nudes.
How can he ignore my available condition? Why these Victorian views?
As if the magic of marbled whiteness could cause a case of sudden amnesia, the kind that makes you forget that you're looking at titties.
You see here before you a woman's definition.
And again, I recognize that the contemporary art world seems a bit aloof, but talk about saying the quiet part out loud.
I must discover the key to his ignition.
Before taking the next few turns of the screw, let's review. Winkelmann tells us that white marble provided a spiritually and intellectually uplifting way to experience the sculpted form, that deviating from this would be distracting and dishonest. But looking at the criticism of Tinted Venus, distraction and dishonesty seem far too mild. Depravity and decadence, maybe.
And then if he should make a diplomatic supposition.
From within the technical marvel that was the Crystal Palace, tinting Venus before a large imperial public wasn't simply an unenlightened experience. Though the problem was that she was colored, and, say it with me,
Honey, 'cause pussy is pink, baby.
In spite of putting words to a great many men's thick, silent, steamy frustration, not even Hiram Powers was immune to this criticism. He too suffered the barbs of our Lord of Scarlet Letters. On viewing what he called the poor nudity of Hiram Powers' Eve Tempted, Hawthorne decried her frightful volume of thighs and calves.
But he made me look. He made me see that terrible sight.
And speculated, I do not altogether see the necessity of ever sculpting another nakedness. Not even so pure and celestial a light as bare stone could withstand such scrutiny. You'll notice that Eve Tempted is entirely uncolored. Which is to say, even white marble provoked concerns for and had peculiar effects upon the flesh.
I said no. No. That's not true. But he said it is.
While touring Rome, Samuel Young Jr. couldn't help himself. While visiting the Academy of Arts at Rome, Samuel Young Jr. admitted, "One or two of the marble female figures there I like better than the Venus de Medici, and had I been alone, I should have kissed them. Couldn't help it."
Think I'm gorgeous. You want to kiss me. You want to hug me.
This rather playful, tongue-in-cheek statement recorded, nevertheless, a moment of inappropriate passion, wherein the beauty, sensuality, and realism of the female nudes inspired the fantasy of a romantic sexual contact between the viewer and the object. To think the scandal had he only been alone.
How can I possibly refuse?
Looking at the way these men describe their experiences, there's a palpable concern with the unwieldy proportions of the female body. There's almost something of the incel in each of them, the shame of their own desire transformed into a disdain for the desired object. As if, in a moment of color-struck passion, the veil was lifted, and we were all let in on a little secret, that this artistic practice was pornographic all along.
I can't listen to this obscenity. Stop her, Doctor.
This movement towards sensual, sexual action, as opposed to moral aesthetic contemplation, was deemed one of the characteristics of bad art, low art, or pornography. I'm not sure how it happened, if by wishful thinking, or if by a mass of elites simply repeating the same talking points. But something about that Enlightenment morality had them really believing.
It's all right, 'cause they're all white.
It seems almost absurd to witness so many people get so worked up over the color of a rock. And then I realized that I'm well on my way to making 9 long-ass videos about divorce court. It seems almost absurd to see people get so worked up over sculpture. And then I remember Charlottesville.
We're honoring all of the great white men who are being smeared and defamed and torn down.
What I mean to say is that fistfights and earthquakes have pretty well-worn causes and effects. But learning how people come to share a sense of sight is always surprising.
And why, when all the evidence points the other way, when we know that the ancient Greeks covered their sculptures in colour, do most of us still think, secretly, that they should be white?
I'm not sure exactly how they did it back in the day, but I for sure remember learning to stifle my own giggles at the sight of bare breasts on canvas. I remember how relentlessly, how insistently, and above all, how subtly I was convinced that art titties weren't titties at all. I don't have the range to make claims about the fleshy threat of 19th century womanhood, but Charmaine Nelson does. By its ability to transform hot-blooded humanity into cool and approachable marble, the classical tradition gave 19th century artists and viewers a way to explore, but at the same time, contain their fascination with alluring and sometimes disturbing subjects. It's a small wonder that so many subjects of classical sculpture were of scandalous women. Salome, Cassandra, Cleopatra, Eve. A rogues gallery of bad bitches.
Where's all my soul sisters? Let me hear your flow, sisters. Hey, sister, go, sister, soul, sister, flow, sister.
In something of a reversal to the Pygmalion story, carving these beauties in marble worked to whitewash these fleshy fantasies. Did I mention Medusa? While this little trick worked for most marble, it didn't for tinted Venus, because she was colored. And, say it with me, like and subscribe. I'm playing.
Honey, cause pussy is pink, baby.
If the purpose of white marble was to render acceptable a certain kind of public pleasure, it makes you wonder about other things. What other forces could be hiding behind runway models, or the world's most famous doll?
So Ruth was discouraged until the day she came upon a German sex doll. The doll in question built Lily. The woman in question, Ruth, thought, hey, let me just steal this design. And on March 9th, 1959, under a new name given as an homage to her daughter Barbara, Ruth presented Barbie to the world.
On the subject of fascination and the threat of sex, in the next video, we'll return to Hawthorne's subcutaneous tobacco stain, the purity of marble, and the alluring drama of miscegenation.
Take a seat, please. Thank you.
But until then, you can share a link,